The sun comes about with the force and the strength, bursting out from the ground like a hound to the race. It's the same every day after day, and to ages unending. And I believe there's more to this than we're getting. It again rose today as I've come to expect, like the bridegroom awakes from his honeymoon bed to the one that he loves and the object of all he can offer. And I believe there's something good here to ponder. The law of the Lord is right, a blazing light, ever making wise the simple. The wisdom of God is whole, restoring the soul and the honor of his people. What can gold mean to my heart when much sweeter fare by far is the counsel of the Holy One, my rock and my Redeemer and my God, my God. The heavens proclaim what I'm trying to say, night after night and day after day. There's no time, there's no place, no speech where the truth is suspending. And I believe that some things need no defending. The law of the Lord is right, a blazing light, ever making wise the simple. The wisdom of God is whole, restoring the soul and the honor of his people. What can gold mean to my heart when much sweeter fare by far is the counsel of the Holy One, my rock and my Redeemer and my God, my God. May the words of my mouth and the thoughts of my heart be pleasing to you, be pleasing to you, my God, my God.
Well, welcome back to session number 4, or once again looking at the story of us. And I mentioned that the word us here includes God. This is not an exclusive little club of our own, but rather something of very, very great significance. And we're going to keep on going because there's so much yet to learn. But before I go on to anything new, just a bit of very quick review. New ideas, you got to hear them over and over again to get them really registered. So here we go. The word covenant is implied belonging to an intentional relationship with a person or a group of people. It's intentional. I've decided to. It's usually accompanied by a vow, all of those things that are so important and very, very unnatural to us in our society. The only image we have of covenant in our culture is the marriage ceremony. Jewish people in the early days had covenants for many, many things. Marriage was just one of them. The Hebrew word originally meant to cut, and instead of giving the rings, the giving of rings is a symbol of the vows. All males were circumcised and shed some of their blood. This was critical to the whole issue of bonding. And if you'll remember, because it's such a special piece of memory, Jesus said, "This is the blood of the covenant I'm shedding for you." Jesus had a passion for covenant way beyond anything that we do. And I pray, oh God, that he gives us that same sense of passion, because it's his passion and it should be ours. Remember how important it was, because it was in the center of the Holy of Holies. And if you had the tabernacle, right in the center of that room was the Ark of the Covenant. And above the covenant was the atonement cover, and above that was the Shekinah glory of God. And that's a tremendous piece of imagery that you could do. As any of you who happen to be pastors, or you're going to do a Bible study, you want to do some research, just fantastic stuff there. We don't have the time to touch that today, but it's glorious. Not only is it central to the Old Testament, it's central to the New Testament, and so we have the covenant is embedded in the most sacred service of all the Bible, the communion service, the Lord's Supper, whatever we wish to call it. This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. You get the imagery of blood there, but you get the imagery of covenant. You get the image of relationship. It's poured out for you. You're going to receive a blessing. And there's a tremendous amount just in those few words. And again, anybody who wants to do preaching, you can take off just on that one word and get all the points you want for a good sermon. The theme phrase for the covenant was, I'll be your God and you'll be my people. Wonderful imagery. It's as if we got married and all of us walked down one aisle and God walked down the other, and he looked over at us and he said the vow, I will be your God. And we looked back at him right in the eye and said, we'll be your people. It's just beautiful imagery. And every time you come across that phrase, just remember, it's talk about covenant. Jewish people knew it automatically, but we don't, because we've lost touch with some of their poetry and the connections between their poetry and their great truths that they held as core values. The mission statement, again, we're just going to skim over it. It's under God. I, we, it's not just I by myself, but it's I in the circle of a community. I'll still be my individual self. I'll still be me. You'll still be you. But we will absolutely work together in a oneness of spirit like you have if we're following God's plan, like God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit are three in one. That's the sense of I, we it's talking about here. And ask the question, if God really wanted us to get it, why would he have begun with Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov, of all the scoundrels? Why did he bring it in? And for me, the most precious thing is that God has a place for the Jacobs of the world in his church and in his covenant relationships. It gives us all hope. And at first it might be very difficult for us to handle and a very awkward thing. I can still remember one time in one of the churches I attended, and it was a bit of an upper crust church. A poor old alky came and walked all the way down to the front and sat down. It was a little bit awkward and a little bit of embarrassing. And one of the ushers carefully came down and talked to him gently and ushered him out. And I went to the pastor afterwards. I said, never again. If you're at all anxious, give me the sign. I'll go and sit beside the person. But this church is for everybody and nobody gets ushered out. That's kingdom theology. That's God of covenant. And it's a very important one. So we're going to follow that as best we can, even though sometimes we struggle with it. And then we went on and we talked about if God wants covenant community with the likes of Jacob and his sons, who don't mind selling their brother Joseph into slavery. This was a rough, tough group of people. You know, this is tribal, raw stuff. This is not the best of families in a nice, organized society. It's much more of a raw thing. Then God has to answer a lot of questions, and we covered some of those questions. We'll just skim over them in a hurry, just so that we don't forget them. The first is, how does a healthy community cope with serious community troubles? And you'll remember we talked about serenity in the storm, and the word is shalom. I'll talk about that in a minute, and just a quick review of all that it covers. Then the second question, how does a healthy community cope with internal conflict? Most of the time when any organization crumbles, it crumbles from within. If I crumble from within. And so we want to look at that very carefully, and that's what we're going to do today. And the answer to that is a very careful restoration and restitution process that the Bible calls justice. And we're going to have to define that because it's a very foreign word to the way we talk about justice when we use it in the ordinary English language. The next question is, what does a healthy community do to meet proactive needs? That's the one that we're going to be doing, and the answer there is social action and fellowship and worship. We'll be talking about some of those dynamics. And again, use the word justice for that. Okay? And we'll see why when we get to it. It means two different kinds of justice. One is what we do in reaction to trouble, and the other is what to do positively, be proactive. But it's just that kind of difference. The next question is, how do members of the community keep from burning out and becoming vengeful? Because we either burn out or we become angry. If we're not careful, those are the two options for us. And unless when we work in community, we've got an answer to that question, let's not get people involved. Too many churches leave a trail of broken, tired out folks with tremendous tension. And God has no intentions of it. There's no need for it. There's an answer to it, and we'll come across it. It's wonderful. It's mercy, unfailing love, kindness, graciousness, forgiveness, and or provision of strength. And it's the word hesed in the Hebrew. And it's the word mercy in our Old Testament. We'll come to that. It's rich, gold mine stuff. You'll love it. And then the last question we're going to ask is, how do the victimizers in the community gain hope so that they can resolve with their victims? Because it's one thing to say we're going to try to get those who are doing wrong to make things right, but they got to want to. And they've got to have the spiritual energy to do so. And usually they got themselves in trouble because they didn't have the spiritual energy. They were bankrupt spiritually. That's why trouble came. So if we're going to find answers, we've got to really ask that kind of question. And the answer to that is praying for victimizers' integrity and their willingness to face correction and reconciliation. The word really isn't pray, it's blessing. And we're going to come at that. It's a tremendous word. And it brings us all the way back to the Jacob story where he's blessed so many times. But finally, the blessing registers. There's some kind of healing and some kind of growth. So that's the whole system. There are other questions and there's some other answers, but we're not going to get into every little detail. I just want you to know God has thought a lot about this. This is not just one little thing that we get on the bandwagon with. It's a complex system that's really worth studying and getting something out of. Now, how does a healthy community cope with serious community troubles? Well, serenity in the storm, that's shalom. The next big question, oh, and we covered that. I want to review the shalom factors for just a second or two very, very quickly, because shalom itself is so powerful and we need to know it. Peace or shalom comes from the covenant concept, and you see underneath there's the covenant of peace, the covenant of shalom. It's right in the scriptures. Shalom and covenant are linked within 3 words. I'm not just sticking it in, it's part of the system. And shalom had a sense of serenity found in the storm center rather than at its flailing edges, the big huge wall around that's so dangerous. Shalom has a sense of health and wholeness within the intentional community of covenanters. We as communities have to learn to be strong enough to handle a bit of rough stuff. And that's got to be part of our training and part of our development, because this is covenant and we're going to ride the storms and we're going to understand that. And we're going to have the Jacobs in our circle, so trouble's going to happen. So it just is, we've got to get our act together on that. Shalom, in its covenant concept, was not a gift for individuals, but for intentional communities. You were asking, is it for private? And you notice what I said here. It's just in the covenant concept, it's for the group as a whole rather than for individuals. And we give each other strength. And that gives us wholeness. And the wholeness gives us shalom, serenity in the storm. So these things aren't just separate ideas. They link together and become very powerful and very useful when you're trying to do solving of a problem in a family or in a small group or in a church, or where pastors had moral failure or something. We don't have to get so panicky as we used to. We've got a gold mine of stuff we can use to respond creatively to them. Okay? They had to be willing to resolve interpersonal difficulties. We're going to come to that today. Everyone in the Shalom community had to be peace officers. I told you about that the last time. We're all called to be that. And serenity has a way of oozing out. It's like liquid, not in a cup or a glass container, but in a peat pot. When you put the Shalom in, it just spreads to everything else around. And when you got a community who really have discovered the power of shalom, always the community around that don't even attend or belong start to get blessed with the same stuff. it's contagious. And it's contagious in a healthy sense, but others get it. And so what happens is something vastly different. We shift from not finishing well as people to becoming people who finish well at the end of our lives, which is so terribly important. Now, having given a quick review of those, because we've got to keep those in mind, this next depends on the previous. It flows, and it's important that we have a thorough understanding. Going back to that covenant concept, the second big question was, how does a healthy community cope with internal conflict? And the answer is by way of restoration and restitution, and the word is justice. Now, difficult word to translate. It does not mean what we mean in the normal word justice in our English dictionary. And so we're going to have to relearn and rethink a lot of stuff. Some of this I got courtesy of some good theologians on the Mennonite side. I'd like to give them good reference because they've done excellent work on it. And I think it's worth ourselves the time to do it. But before we get going, I got a real question. I don't know how many of you are real Bible believers, but I got a question for you. Okay. Do you remember when Nathan the prophet had a conversation with David after David had had his affair with Bathsheba and then tried to cover things up by having Uriah, her husband, murdered? Do you remember the encounter? I talked about it. Nathan came in and he laid the charges. Okay. I want to read to you because it's important. This is what Nathan said. Okay. You struck down Uriah the Hittite with the sword. You took his wife to be your own. You killed him with the sword of the Ammonites. Then David said to Nathan, I have sinned against the Lord. So he pled guilty. Now, you've got to understand that. He was being charged. Now he's pleading guilty. He's going through a due process, having broken the law. And then look at this. Nathan replied, the Lord has taken away your sin. You're not going to die. Now, I got a question. I don't know about you reading your Bible, but me and the Lord sometimes have some real arguments. And this is one of the ones that I used to have. Okay. The question is simply this. How did David get off the hook that easily? You ever ask that question? It's just like a words of magic and the whole thing's over. And I want you to keep that in the back of your head because I want to do some teaching before we come back to it. There's some good answers to the question. But we're going to have to really do some thorough learning before we can come back. And as we do the learning, will help us understand not just the answer to this question, but how we need to be thinking and responding when there's trouble in our community and scoundrels do bad things, which they will do no matter what. That's just the nature of the beast, okay? So to understand, in the Canadian justice system, and this is a very fast crash course on Canadian Justice 101, and then it's about an A minus of that because it's just a tiny fraction. But if somebody commits an offense, hopefully what happens is the person gets arrested, and then eventually he gets taken to court, and if he's proven guilty, he's given a sentence. End of 101. Okay? Very simplistic. There's a lot more to it, and you all know that. But it serves the purpose for us understanding the Hebrew people had a separate step to their justice system that they added to this complex. And we have to understand it if we're ever going to get clear on what it's all about. In the early Hebrew justice system, what we have is an intermediary step between the arrest and after the arrest and before they go to court. And we'll call it the reconciliation opportunity. It's a hard word to translate. The Hebrew word is rev, which means complaint or controversy. It's just a vague word, but it's a very powerful word. And I learned it from a fellow by the name of a Catholic scholar by the name of Bavati. He wrote in Italian. They translated his thesis into English, which was hard to understand. But he methodically went all the way through the Old Testament and studied every single time this word comes up. And it comes up a tremendous number of times. And he makes a case an absolute solid case for the fact that the children of Israel had this as part of their practice. What is more, if in the process that you had this reconciliation opportunity, if reconciliation was successful, then the parties did not go to court and they never got sentenced. Reconciliation was the ultimate goal. And if you had reconciliation, everything else fell into place. And it really is a difficult thing for us Westerners to get around. So I'm going to take my time and explain it just a bit more from several different angles, okay? We have to look at this reconciliation process, and when you get to the Bible, where there's been an offense and the word justice is used, I'm not talking now about proactive justice, but this reactive, where there's been an offense, the word justice only refers to this phase of the justice process. It does not refer to anything else. Okay. If you wanted to take a look, and by the way, just for us to have it clear, we've stuck the word restorative justice to it. I like that phrase. Okay? But if you read any of the literature, restorative justice is the catchphrase that says reconciliation is the way to justice. Now, the Bible doesn't use the phrase restorative justice, but we have to, and I'll tell you why in a few minutes, because of our crazy concepts otherwise. When you look at, in the Old Testament, the court process and the sentence, there you got the phrase the wrath of God. So when you took a person to court, you had wrath. And in the Bible, it teaches the wrath of God. But what we've got to get into our heads is before the wrath of God can come, any person who's done something wrong has to be given a chance to restore. We're going to come to the passage that really makes this clarion clear. But I want us to catch the concept first, okay? Even Jesus taught this restorative justice principle. He said, if your brother sins against you, this is that passage in Matthew 18 where we call it church discipline. What a misnomer. We missed what it says here. Okay? Read it. If your brother sins against you, go and show him his fault just between the two of you. If he listens to you, you have won your brother over. The first step that Jesus taught was the reconciliation step. We can't go on to the second step unless that has been genuinely offered. Now, the thing about the story in Matthew 18 is Jesus talks about it so brief we misunderstand it. But when he talked to the children of Israel, his disciples, they all knew this rich background of Old Testament stuff. We don't. So we miss just by not looking up. We're not tuned in to look for those kind of details. And so we go on and call it a disciplinary approach, when it really is essentially is restorative. If the restoration fails, then we're going to have to use the wrath of God. There's going to have to be discipline. Things go wrong, they have to be accounted for. But the goal is reconciliation. Within the Canadian justice system, the word justice as a response to wrongdoings implies punishing the wrongdoer. But for the early Hebrews, the word justice as a response to wrongdoing implies restoring to former times. And I want you to see the difference between the two. We have a punishment mode in Canada. That's why we go right from the arrest to the court. Proven guilty, zap them. That's just the way it is. And in our country, we're gradually getting more punitive. So the big clarion cry, and the politicians win and get a lot of people voting for them when they get tough on crime. And I've been a chaplain. I know how badly we need to be disciplined when it comes to bad wrongdoers. But I want the kind of discipline that helps us all finish well in the end. And you know something? It costs us billions of dollars in tax dollars to keep guys in prison, and at the end they don't finish well. We've got to think about it. We allow ourselves to get ripped off beyond belief as a society because of it. Okay? Now the next thing that's very important is the Canadian justice system. The word justice is a response to wrongdoing, and we can use the word justice to bring, justice to the poor, and that's a proactive thing. But when it's in response to wrongdoing, it applies only to the wrongdoer. Okay? If you go to the Hebrew, for the early Hebrew, the word justice as a response to wrong done was applied to both the victim and the wrongdoer. And I want you to see that. It's quite different. Now, why we have this difference is that in the Canadian justice system, we don't get the word justice defined by the Bible or the Hebrew tradition or anything that was taught from way back there. We get in the English the word justice as defined by the Roman Empire. And the Romans saw justice as this blind lady holding up a set of scales, one hand carrying a sword. If you did something wrong on this side, what did they do? They put a punishment on the other side to make the scale balance. You know the picture. Okay? It's a very simple one. We got taught it when we were kids. There's two flaws to it. And those of you who are into philosophy, think about it. Two very, very big flaws. The first, and you'll argue with me at first if you're an intellect, but stay with me. The first is you can't have justice when your eyes are covered. And God, the judge of all the earth, has never had his eyes covered. He sees the whole thing. And I know the intent of the blindfold was so that the person would be non-judgmental and treat everybody exactly the same so they couldn't have favorites. Okay? But the essential problem is they couldn't see. And we have people in prison who are in prison and named guilty and then later on discover they're totally innocent because we can't see. We don't have a justice system that sees well. We almost prefer for blindness a bit. And that's dangerous. The second flaw is far deeper. It's a flaw that every mother who's trying to raise kids, you've got more than one kid in your house, you gotta be forever teaching them. Two wrongs don't make a right. How many mothers have said that to their kids? Okay? Fathers too. And yet in our justice system, that's exactly what we teach. Two wrongs do make a right. Think about it. You do something wrong and the scale goes down here, then we'll do something wrong over here. So the scales come up to even. Two wrongs. Comes even, so it's got to be right. Jewish person would look at that, the old Jewish man, and say, how crazy can you be? If somebody does something wrong on the scales down this side and you want the scales to be even, take the wrong off the scale. And the scales will balance. But then you don't have to do a wrong to make it look good. A vastly different concept. The second thing that's very important is that in our justice system, we only look for the wrongdoer, not for both. And that can be very, very tragic. We leave a trail of very traumatized victims that often have no address. My wife and I and children one time years ago in a car accident, very serious car accident. Thought we were going to get killed. It was very spectacular. None of us got hurt, but the car was totally demolished and all the rest. And it turned out later, the policeman thought that the man who crashed into us had done so intentionally because he was trying to commit suicide. Well, he didn't die in the accident. He ended up in the hospital. And, I had 3 children and my wife. We got home. We talked about it all. I explained to the kids what it was all about. And my youngest daughter said, that man must feel awful if he wants to die. We should go and see him. Daddy, can we go and see him? So I phoned the policeman. What hospital do you take him to? Oh, we don't tell you that. They never let us find out. They're going to keep us apart. And that's not good. No, you don't want to get them together where it's dangerous. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But what happens in the early Hebrew society is we'd have been able to meet. We'd have talked it through. We'll see that in a few minutes. And of course, things can go wrong there too. Don't misunderstand me. But a lot less can go wrong. So that there's a place here for victims in the Hebrew system that we don't have in our justice system. We're trying to work it in. We have some auxiliary services that come in, and if you happen to be in the right court and you've got the right worker, some good things do happen for the victims. But not always the case, not by a long shot. So we've got to look on. Just how did the early Hebrew justice proceed with the biblical justice system? This is very, very sort of interesting. Just a little bit of tidbit for you to sort of think about. Many, many different ways it could get going in the first place. Job, as a complainant, one time began by saying, "Even today my complaint is very bitter." And you could read on to the rest, but he was laying now a charge, this time against God. He was having an argument with God. And he was wanting to have a settlement. God speaks back, and he could speak back, and finally get a proper reconciliation. Okay? David, as we've said before, said to Nathan the prophet, "I have sinned against the Lord." Abigail, we've seen before, said, "My Lord, let the blame be on me alone." It really didn't matter how you got started. Okay? But Bhavati, the one I was talking to you about before, the Catholic scholar, did come up with a careful study of one or two or three archaeological finds and put the story together. And what they actually did, on the whole, at least this was their ideal scenario, was they would bring the complainant and the wrongdoer together down to the city gate. Okay? The whole town would come out. The elders would be at the city gate. They kept the two apart. You don't want to have them fighting now that so it's got to give safety. And people ensured that the victim didn't get hurt a second time. And it usually was the victim who was given the first chance to explain their position. Why did you do this? Do you know what it did to me? Do you know how my children felt? Do you know this? They could say anything. And all the villagers, as they listened, if they liked the person's story, they would move over and stand beside or behind the victim. Okay? Then when the victimizer had said their full first statement, then the victimizer, the guy who had done wrong, would get his chance and say, "Yeah, but look at what you did to me," or whatever. And as people heard his story, they might move behind him. And actually the whole town sort of moved back and forth as they listened to these two arguing and discussing. And they start out as opponents, just like in our courts. But there's a big difference. In our courts, you start out as an opponent if you're the victim or the offender, and you end as opponents. The goal of reconciliation was something vastly different. That gradually as they talked and the tempers cooled down, and you remember these Arab mentalities, it can get pretty hot, so it's okay. They're used to pretty hot. The goal was, in the end, if I was the guilty person, I would look at the person I've offended and say, "I'm really sorry, and I'll make some restitution. Would you please forgive me?" And only when we shook hands would they say justice is served. Reconciliation was the goal. Vastly different from ours.